let's first talk about the article that you wrote, and
Sure.
it was for Kentucky Bench and Bar, really a call to action. Tell me a little bit what you were hoping this would do, kind of reassess where we are in Kentucky?
Well, I think, Rachel, I think you nailed it, a call to action. I think so many have been working on reform in the state, and rightfully so. It was, certainly, it was a mission field for so many, but there was so little progress prior to, let's say, 2011, when we passed a landmark piece of legislation, which was House Bill 463. But we woke up to a reality then that I think few realized. I mean, again, there was always the need for reform. We knew we had too many people in prison. We knew we weren't getting a great return on investment. Recidivism was too high. People were returning to prison too often. But when you wake up and you realize that not only do you have too many people in prison, but your prison growth rate is nearly quadruple the national average. And at that time, for the decade ending in 2010, it was 45%. Our prisons were growing at that rate. The national average was 13%, at a time when all state prison populations, for the most part, were exploding. And this is in a country which comprises, the U.S. does, less than 5% of the world's population, but incarcerates, locks up nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. And it's worse for women. 1 out of every 3 women locked up somewhere in the world is here in the United States. And so when you realize that you live in a state which is truly the epicenter for prison growth and mass incarceration, then I think there is a call to action. I think, and there was at that time. And I think what we can get into the details of this later, but simply put, that was the appropriate response. Many of us would have gone much further and been bolder, but politics being the art of the doable, we did what we could at that time. And I think it was quite a bit. I mean, it was considered landmark. Because of it, we're not at 35,000 people in prison today. Actually, I think we're probably less than 18,000 people in prison today. Some of that's due to COVID and some of the releases that have been issued by the governor and some of the early release, some of the clemency granted. That said, which, still we were trending downward, and I hope, it's our hope, I think, and again, I'm not as involved, clearly I hadn't been for over a year on a day-to-day basis with the corrections population, but hoping that when this all lifts, and then we can return to some sense of normalcy after the pandemic, that we can continue the lessons learned during COVID. I mean, public safety hasn't been endangered. I mean, people in prison don't equate to public safety, and that's another lesson we could talk about. And that's what's hard for, I think, some folks to realize.
Well, let's talk about, I just want to go back and say again, when all of this, and we should say lawmaker for you, secretary in the Justice Department, or here locally in Kentucky, no longer. We'll talk about some of the other work that you do in a little bit. But I want to go back to what you just said. Kentucky was the epicenter. We were leading when it came to prison populations. I don't know that everybody realized that.
Yeah.
What year was that?
Well, there was the Pew Charitable Trust. They began sometime 2 or 3 years prior to that decade I mentioned. So maybe 2006-07 began a public safety performance project. My good friend Adam Gelb was the director there. I'm still, again, as you know, involved with him at the Council on Criminal Justice now. And we were leading the world and were essentially at the top of their list when they published a report called 1 in 100, which meant that in the United States, 1 out of every 100 adults was in prison. I mean, 1 out of every 92 in Kentucky at that time. And Kentucky was singled out as having the fastest growing prison population in the country.
And it didn't necessarily equate to a booming crime rate either, right? I mean, the crime, and that was one thing when I saw that, I thought you would think, oh, crime rate's higher, more people in prison. No.
In fact, again, as we stated in the article, in fact, that crime rate, when that decade ended, 2009, 2010, that time frame, was the same as it was in 1974. And Kentucky was then in 74, was then in 2009 and 10, and is today one of the safer states in the country. We've been a bottom 5, state in terms of safety, meaning good, top 5. And Tennessee on the other end is not. They're higher. their crime rate's much higher. So it's not regional. Kentucky, and by the way, some would then think, well, is that because we're incapacitating people? Is prison the reason? And criminologist after criminologist after economist after economist have continued to study that issue nationally and globally, and that's actually not the reason. Crime rates and per capita rates of incarceration don't have that much relationship. There's a very small portion of crime rates which are attributable to prison per capita rates, right? So, clearly you could incapacitate half your population and crime might drop a little bit, but that's not,
Right.
that's not doable.
So,
and
so then what was going on? Why were we the world leader? What was happening if it wasn't because of a booming crime, rate?
Well, I think number one, I think you can point to the increase in drug arrests. There was a 70% over a very short period of time. There was a 70% increase in drug arrests. So, as the drug epidemic got worse, and there was a different face on the epidemic at that time than there is today, but the dynamic is the same. I think the response of the system due to addiction, substance use disorder, mental illness, for a number of reasons, our default response to those disorders have become jail and prison. And so rather than getting someone who needs the treatment they need, or the mental health treatment and or that substance use disorder treatment they need, or both, because oftentimes the majority of those individuals have co-occurring disorders, we tend to lock folks up. And that's borne out in the data. You can't escape the numbers. We had this 70% increase in drug arrests. And by the way, the majority of those are for possession only. They're not traffickers.
They're low-level offenses.
They're very low-level offenses that could be handled in the community with additional treatment. And and that's one of the things we're proud of. We, as a state, I'm proud of what our administration did and what we helped previous administrations do when I was in the legislature, and that is grow treatment capacity. As we stated in the article again, we went from 1,500 slots to 6,000 treatment slots in corrections alone. So that doesn't mean there are only that many slots throughout the state, but that's just available to corrections. I would submit, though, we probably need more like 20,000 slots, 30,000 slots. The demand for treatment is that much. Now, I know, but on the bright side, generally, the capacity for treatment in the state, the drug policy debate, we've come so far. And Kentucky is a true leader in drug policy. And we're close to on-demand treatment now in this state, which when we were at Justice, we had drug control policy. Proud that we were able to work with folks like Unite in East Kentucky and other folks across the state and establish essentially a 24/7 hotline, an online treatment locator, a number you can call, and talking to my friend Van Ingram, who's still there as the director, talking to him just a couple of 3 months ago. If someone needs a treatment bed, we can find it now, and that wasn't always the case. And oftentimes we can find it before the business day ends.
Right.
That's incredible.
So let's talk about the fact we were a world leader in prison population. Then something happened to change that we became a leader in reform. And was that in part because of House Bill 463 when we started asking tough questions in 2010, from everything I gather? And some of those questions that you asked I thought were really interesting in that article. Who are we afraid of, or what are we afraid of? And what were the questions we asked? And then what was the catalyst for change?
Yeah, that quote has been attributed to me, and it was not, I don't remember where I first heard it, but it stuck with me that we need to distinguish who we're mad at and who we're afraid of. And really, prison should be reserved for the most serious offenders, and those are long-term beds, to be distinguished from jail. Jail's another question altogether. We need to be incarcerating people pre-trial at lesser rates. That's another debate.
Right, we could go on and on.
I know, it just always leads to something else,
Yeah.
but we need to really reduce or end cash bail. That's another, we need pretrial reform. But I think some of those questions, that's a great point you raise. What are we trying to get from our criminal justice system? If it's what I think most people expect is public safety, then we can't turn away from what the numbers tell us, the data. We're not any safer when we lock up low-level offenders, people who need treatment. Again, whether it be drug treatment or mental health treatment or both, we're not safer. It costs us taxpayers dearly. It siphons money away from other resources like law enforcement, like better better pay for corrections officers, so we can maintain good folks behind the wall and make careers of those jobs. Probation and parole officers, so key to have good folks, and there are good dedicated folks. But when you're paying them, in the mid-30s and requiring a 4-year college degree, it's tough for them to stick around. They look for the next best opportunity. So ultimately, we have to ask ourselves, what do we want to get from this system? And don't we expect a better return on investment from our public safety dollar, our criminal justice investment? And what the numbers told us at the time, I think what spurred that reform was, it was really embarrassing. I mean, we didn't know anything. We didn't know what we were getting for our tax dollar. State tax dollars really do 3 things mainly, and state governments: educate, medicate, and incarcerate. And across the country, Kentucky wasn't alone. We just happened to be leading the world in growth, but we weren't alone. And all states can really say the same thing. And the fastest growing segment of any state budget behind Medicaid was corrections. And that was true across the board. And so now what we see from that decade, Kentucky was one of the first states, thankfully, to invest in a way, what the theory is called justice reinvestment. But really it's about looking at your systems and reforming them, as we've discussed. But since that time, again, we've managed our population better. We bent the growth curve, which was the most important thing. We've now seen this drop, and we've seen some, a little bit of ebb and flow. I mean, so the results have been mixed. As you know, I'm frustrated about the lack of implementation. There's a lot of discretion in the bill. You can either use the tools or not. But I think ultimately, state prison populations have come down. The vast majority have come down. And that's a good thing. But we still have 2.3 million people at any given time, jail, prison, federal prison as well, total incarcerated, and we still lead the world. The country does lead the world. So, and Kentucky still has a long way to go.
So what do you think worked? Let's talk about 2 things that you really think worked with that House bill. Then let's talk about what still needs to be done, what we have failed at with that, and what you think are the main things we need to tackle. 2 things that I guess HB 463 did well.
Well, I think it holds us accountable, and so what that means is the data that we have to rely upon comes every year. There has to be an accounting for that, and there's also an accounting for the savings, and so there is some attention paid, by those who draft the budget, to what are we saving, and then where's that being reinvested, again, along the lines of justice reinvestment. And so what that's allowed is some of those savings to help us enhance treatment options at corrections. So you've seen those treatment slots go from 1,500 to 6,000. So that freed up some money, and it showed other policymakers and executives the ability to do that it was possible. Because still today, there really are no significant line items for treatment. The legislature does not appropriate direct monies for treatment outside of those savings in the bill. And so, there are, every 2 years, Kentucky operates on a biennial budget, so every 2 years, there is money allocated through savings, through savings and incarceration and corrections, to enhance treatment options behind the wall, and then in supervision as well. So we can contract with corrections, that is, can enter into contracts with community mental health centers, our network throughout the state. There's 14 of those centers, so they're able to provide outpatient treatment for those in supervision. So that's probably one of the best results of the bill. A long answer to that question. And the second may be just modernizing the drug code. I mean, this reality that substance use disorder, addiction, is a disease of relapse, and we have to, by its very nature, folks are going to fail. I mean, that's just like someone with diabetes. Again, it's a chronic addiction is a chronic brain disorder, and people are going to relapse, are going to fail, and that's part of the disease. And the system is not really set. It wasn't set up. And it still has a long way to go. But I think the bill built in safeguards and helped others grow into that reality that we have to meet people where they are, And rather than sending somebody back to prison for that failure, that relapse, why don't we reconnect them to treatment? Why don't we make sure they have transportation and reentry in a stable home, a stable housing situation, a roof over their heads? And oh, by the way, let's look for employment. Employment is transformational. And there are, by the way, there are 65 to 70 million Americans with some form of a criminal record. And in Kentucky, many of those folks with those records are dealing with these issues. But we know this. When we find them meaningful employment, they actually stick to treatment more often. And by the way, they miss less work days than other workers on average. Those who are in active treatment. I mean, so we know that doesn't mean someone's a damaged good,
right,
because A, they have a criminal record, or they have a substance use disorder, or dealing with a mental health condition. That may seem overwhelming to an employer, but that's the reality when you have so many people suffering in this way.
And not just substance. I was looking at different things where we fall short, and the disparity of how that works. Let's talk about some of the things that you would still like to happen. Low-level drug peddling. I think, some of the charges that come with that. Monetary bail that you mentioned. There are things we still need. Where do you see top 3 things you would like to see improve in Kentucky?
Well, I think top of mind, I think we need to end cash bail. I think that we have a great system in Kentucky. We're the only unified pretrial system in the country. And that's sort of a policy wonk thing to say, but we're situated where we could do that better than any other state. Yet we're not doing that. We've had significant pretrial reform, which is part of House Bill 463. But we are incarcerating far too many low-level offenders pre-trial. That means before their case is adjudicated, awaiting trial. We actually looked at numbers in 2016, and this will boggle your mind. It still does mine. We have 75 plus or so, 76 full-service jails across the state. We were incarcerating that year in 2016, our first year in the administration at Justice. We had, and we worked with the court system for these numbers, but 37 or 38,000 offenders, individuals were serving time pre-trial. They were assessed at low to moderate risk, which means, according to the bill, they should have been released, but they weren't. For whatever reason, they weren't. Judges were overriding what was a presumption of release, and they were holding them oftentimes on very low bond amounts. But 38,000 offenders serving an average of 109 days in jail. At a significant cost. Some estimate that cost, depending on jail per diem cost, to be over $120 million, borne by county taxpayers unnecessarily. And that kind of incarceration, it can destroy a life. You lose a job, lose connection to family.
And the disparity of who can pay that bail and who can't
is problematic in and of itself.
And why would we incarcerate? Why would we continue to cage somebody for their inability to write a check to bond out of jail? So someone who is alleged to have committed a murder could, with the resources, could bond out and be free. But someone who's written a bad check and arrested, or someone who is in there for a low-level drug offense and under a $500 bond, who doesn't have that $500 may well be, it might as well be $500,000 to someone who doesn't have $500.
Right.
And so that's actually, I think there's a lot of argument that it's actually unconstitutional, and it is. But there's and again there's some legal reasoning that it's still allowable in this country, and many of us think it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be that way.
So let me ask, with this, how do you get more people involved to these are complicated issues. I mean, you've been studying them for years and years and years. As a taxpayer, though, we should care because, like you said, to make sure why people need to invest in this and know these numbers, because we're the ones picking up the tab, correct? I mean, our money should be well spent.
Right. And I don't think anybody, and here's the thing, taxpayers, absolutely. And the thing about that's still significant about this movement, which began, again, over 10 years ago, and again, I've been so pleased to be a part of it, is that it's nonpartisan. There's just as much enthusiasm from the right as there is from the left, politically, and in the middle, those moderates. And again, we've always approached this in a nonpartisan way. I still look back on my dear friend Tom Jensen, who is the Republican Judiciary Chair in the Senate when I was House Chair back during the time we worked on House Bill 463 and spent almost an entire year together in 2010 with this an incredible task force, which had current Executive Cabinet Secretary J. Michael Brown, my predecessor at Justice, had Chief Justice John Minton, who's still the Chief Justice, who was on this task force, Guthrie True over in Frankfurt, Tom Handy was a retired prosecutor, and I know I'm forgetting somebody, and I'll come circle back around, but so many contributions from Ed Monahan, who was the public advocate then, who I mentioned in the article, but so many came together in that effort and worked in a way that was nonpartisan. And so taxpayers, I think the public is again slowly waking up to this idea that we can't build our way to public safety. Those on the right, those on the left continue to say the same things and come together in some fundamental principles that we should all look to. I think I think it is possible to continue to make progress, but we're going to have to become even more bold. And I think we've got still such a long way to go. You saw the federal reform that happened just a couple of years ago. Now I may be going on 3 years, close to it. The First Step Act, the federal First Step Act. That was the first reform in decades at that level. And even though the federal prison population is down, we still have individuals serving, inordinately long sentences for drug crimes that, some folks who really don't present a danger to public safety. And that's certainly true of our own population
Right.
here in Kentucky and across the country. But, and you asked, if I could, you asked about what things I'd like to see. And rather than drill down on each one, cash bail is just one, but we need to reclassify drug possession. That no longer needs to be a felony. States like West Virginia, Oklahoma, they've looked at Tennessee, but Oregon, but states which are very politically diverse have all come to that conclusion. Oklahomans put it on the ballot and said that drug possession will always be a misdemeanor. Utah, a conservative state, did the same thing.
So there's an awakening with all of these
There
things.
is. And we presented that option to the legislature in 2017, 2018. We had an assessment council when I was a justice. I chaired that 23-member Criminal Justice Policy Assessment Council. We presented, that was one of 23 recommendations, and sadly they were all rejected.
So do you think the rejection of that is that no one wants to, and I'm just guessing here, I don't know the answer. Is it that they don't want to be perceived as soft on crime? Is that what it is?
I think certainly that's a large element of it, and I think it's it is tough, and so.
But the dollars and cents don't support what they're rejecting.
The data doesn't support it. The policy doesn't support it. The best practices don't support it. So if we really want to achieve better public safety, then we would do these things, because states which have, again, I always pointed to, here's another one, is the felony threshold level. This is the one that baffles me.
Explain that one.
Well, so in Kentucky now, so when I was first elected in 06 and I started serving in 07, our felony threshold level was $300. It was one of the lowest in the country. So if you stole something that was worth that, it was a felony. And many people would say, okay, well, it hadn't changed in years. And so it hadn't risen with inflation. So when it was initially set, decades ago at that level, it hadn't risen. So I filed a bill when I first took over the Judiciary Committee in 2009 to increase that from $300 to $1,000, which really, if you followed inflation, it would have been even higher than that. And oh, by the way, Texas, I don't think anybody looks at Texas as soft on crime. Theirs is $2,500. Georgia is $2,000.
In order to be charged with a felony.
Right.
And Kentucky is $300.
It was. My
okay.
bill, we had to compromise. The Retail Federation was worried. We have 7 border states. They're worried about being able to extradite those who commit theft. I think that worry is misplaced. That can still happen. There are a number of studies that also indicate that when you increase that, there's a seminal study on this that was done by the Pew Charitable Trusts that essentially says that it doesn't, when you do this, like Texas did it, increase it to $2,500, like Georgia did, like so many states across the country, we're in the minority. There's only 5 states that are as low as us now. I'll get to that in just a minute. But it does not increase, theft levels. It actually has a positive impact on public safety. You save money and get better public safety is the end result. But so back to the story. So we were able to get it to 500, but that was in 09. And so fast forward to to 17 to 18, we all know it needs to go to closer to a Texas or a Georgia or the vast majority of the country. Yet for some reason we can't find the political will. I mean, even law enforcement was ready to support, and of course they've been, obviously outspoken, but working together to try to get a better product and coming to the table to work with us. They were prepared to support an increase to $1,000. But for some reason, it still languishes at $500.
We're still at 500. And how many states still have that low level?
Only 5 other states.
Only 5 other states.
And don't hold me to that roughly.
But roughly, a handful.
Yeah. Numbers
Just a
tend to,
handful.
legislatures meet all the time, things change, but roughly 5 states.
So there does seem to be more of an awakening with reform in all forms, criminal justice, police reform, all of those things that we hear. You've used the word twice, though, in this conversation where you said, we need to be bold. When you say bold, what do you mean, and what would it take for you to go, now that's bold? That's what we need to be doing.
Well, we need to end cash bail. That doesn't mean we don't detain folks who present a public safety threat, but that needs to be the trigger, not whether you can pay. We need to reclassify drug possession. We need to treat it like the chronic brain disorder and the disease that it is. And that can be borne out in a number of things by making drug possession a misdemeanor. Again, folks will be looking at what Oregon just did was huge decriminalization of drugs across the board in many ways. So folks will be looking at Oregon in that regard. That's bold. We need to adopt the other 21 of those 23 recommendations. So many things we can do. Why not? Here's an easy one. Why not for all non-DUI traffic offenses? Why do those require jail or prison? Those should be handled. Those should be reduced to violations. One example: Utah took 250 plus misdemeanors that could result in up to 12 months in jail, and they reduced those to violations, where they're no longer punishable by jail or prison. So that's bold, but that's working in Utah. Public safety has not been harmed in that way. We could reduce all the enhancements that continue to tack on additional prison time. By the way, even longer sentences don't equate to better public safety either. We need to get bold and look at sentence length. One thing that it's hard for folks, through the years, I had so many incredible colleagues in the legislature when I was a justice. I had some who couldn't come around to the idea that we've been making the same mistakes since 1971, meaning we continue to think that we can again lock people up to get better safety, that we can incarcerate our way out of the drug problem, that we can do those kinds of things. And ultimately, longer sentences do nothing to deter drug crime. They do nothing to get people clean and sober. They just don't. And the research bears that out time and again. There are things we can do. And we've done some of those things. We need to get better at probation and parole supervision. There's so many ways we can link people to resources in the community. We need to link together with what we do have, with nonprofits, with the faith-based community. One thing that people don't talk about was we built in language to make it easier in 463, make it easier for the system to link with those nonprofits, with the faith-based community, so there are no barriers. We've done that time and again with treatment. Kentucky's led the way. We have been bold in drug policy, and that's what we have gotten recognition for that.
So you say we need to get to that in other areas.
When I say drug policy, I mean things that aren't necessarily related to the criminal justice system. And so we were the first state to adopt the CDC's recommendation to limit opioid prescriptions to 3 days, because addiction begins between 3 and 5 days with opioids. They're incredibly addictive. There are exceptions for that, obvious medical exceptions that doctors can use. So we were the first to do it. I believe we're still the only state to be at 3 days.
So we have been a leader.
We were the first state to mandate the use, and we had the gold standard, the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program. We call it CASPR. We were the first state to mandate its use, so that doctors would have to go to it when they prescribe you an opioid. They have to go to it and say, what else is my patient getting and where? Prevents doctor shopping, but it's also good medical practice. I've had so many physicians talk about it being just a part of their practice. But we took a lot of, when we pushed that, I can remember current Senate President Robert Stivers and I went on this summer-long tour trying to sell that idea after we passed it. And we took a lot of heat, but now it's just accepted because it was the best. It was good policy. It's good medical policy, good drug policy.
So that is, your intent is to educate,
Sure.
and to show the studies and to show the research that we don't keep making the same mistakes that we've been making since 1971. You're doing that on a national level. Tell us about CCJ and then a new group that you're now affiliated with as well.
Yeah, when I left, actually before I left Justice, I was part of a task force on federal priorities, how we could continue the reform of the federal system, the next steps after the First Step Act. It was chaired by a good friend, Governor Nathan Deal of Georgia, former Governor Nathan Deal, who was responsible for so much positive reform momentum in his own state. He was a judge who was a congressman, but he'd been on the bench. He understood the system, and so he spent his 8 years wisely, but had very diverse folks like a Sally Yates or Mike Nutter, former mayor of Philadelphia, Mark Holden or David Safavian from the American Conservative Union. So we had a very balanced group, 14 of us. Well, that led to, when I left Justice, a senior fellowship with my good friend Adam Gelb, I mentioned there at the council. And the council really wants to establish itself as the criminal justice analog to the Council on Foreign Relations. And so a national membership organization, a think tank, but really a center of gravity for the field, not advocating on the ground level in states, but advocating for the use of better data, better evidence, better policy, again, adopting the best practices, things which actually work to decarcerate, to get us better public safety at less cost, by the way, so resources can be plowed back in and reinvested into the system elsewhere. And so I remain a senior fellow there. I've enjoyed the work. There's a current policing task force. We actually just finished with a national commission, COVID commission. And by the way, again, I was so proud to be a contributor to the National COVID Commission on Criminal Justice. It was chaired, we don't know that this has ever happened before, but it was chaired by two former attorneys general, Alberto Gonzales, the Republican, and Loretta Lynch, the Democrat. And
that's what you said, this is a bipartisan.
yeah. And for them to come together, and I spent, I listened in on most every meeting, and to watch that group, again, very politically diverse group, talk about how COVID's impacted criminal justice, and the idea is that we need to learn lessons that we continue to employ and utilize after COVID. Given that we've seen a decarceration, we've seen fewer people in prison for a couple of reasons. Obviously, releases for to try to clear up space and to try to get people out of what is a dangerous place. Obviously, Kentucky's suffered with a couple of prisons at incredibly high rates of infection. Our jails are petri dishes for infection and the spread of COVID, and so we're trying to get people out of these incarcerations. And what we'd like to see is for us to adopt these practices going forward. If folks don't present a public safety threat, why are we locking them up? And so that was the work of the council and this commission, and so many good people. Tom Inglesby at Johns Hopkins. Tom's had more since COVID. It's had more airtime than most celebrities, and so I learned so much being part, and I contributed in many ways. Obviously, opioids in the criminal justice system was one area in which I contributed, but just being part of the team. I was not on that task force, having been a senior fellow, but then I was, as part of my job at the council, I was helping to advise a new tech startup, nonprofit, almost all formerly Google execs and engineers and product managers. They began a volunteer project 3 or 4 years ago, which then became such a mission for some of them that they left Google, left higher salaries to enter the nonprofit world. Some incredible people. Our founder, Clementine Jacoby, is 29 years old. She's at Forbes 30 Under 30, really incredibly promising.
And the name of that organization?
Recidiviz.
And tell us what the whole mission is, the statement for them.
Ultimately, much like the council, to be a place, a center, a place for truth using data in the field, to not advocate on the ground, but to use tech to come alongside and complement the good work that's being done in states and in criminal justice systems at the federal level as well, currently working in a number of states across the country. But the vision, and Clementine has two great co-founders with her, Andrew Warren and Joshua Essex. All three came from Google. Some folks have come from Apple, Dropbox, all this tech talent. I'm the criminal justice guy. I meet with the three founders weekly, but I'm dedicating the majority of my time, the vast majority of my time, to this effort, and it's really transformational. I've never seen anything like it. We're able to come into a state, build a data layer on top of whatever system is there, and within a couple, 3 months, we're then able to produce real-time data that will inform policymakers, executives. We start at the leadership level. Right now, the model is we start at the leadership level in corrections. So a corrections director, commissioner, secretary would be able to set goals and be able to see any kind of data that comes in. We're able to normalize it, meaning so it's digestible, so that it's understandable, and you could drill down on a case as well. So you have this incredible use of data we've never had. I never
You said
had
you were
it.
flying blind.
So many of us in the legislature for years were flying blind. This enables us, and that doesn't mean we weren't using data, but oftentimes it was historical data. So we go back and have consultants come in, or nonprofits come in. In this case, in Kentucky, we had the Pew Charitable Trust, and they were able to invest their money, not taxpayer dollars, in looking at data. So we got a picture looking backward. Well, the difference is with real-time data, you're looking forward, and you can make decisions in real time. So we hope to leverage this data and decision-making power into better practices, the best practices, and also we can model policy impact. So legislators may come with something that to the field looks like really good progressive or forward-thinking criminal justice policy, and some may come with policy that isn't so forward-looking. But we can model the impact of that. We can say, you do this, you'll save this many life years in prison, you can return $10 million to the taxpayer, or by the way, if you adopt this, the opposite could be true. You'll fill your prison and you'll cost your taxpayers an additional $10 million
So
per
this
se.
is profound. I mean, that you have this kind of data.
I truly think it's profound, and I think many in the field feel that way, and that's why we receive so much support from so many funders on that you might consider the left or the right. To us, it's a truly nonpartisan approach. We are driven by the data, driven by the tech, and so the efforts are very similar. And I'm just continually struck by, it's not as if we're locked away or our folks are locked away producing products and doing the work that software engineers do and product managers do. And again, I listen on these calls and I'm really spellbound by the kind of tech I'm listening in on, because that's not my field. And again, I'm the one that typically makes jokes about, being the guy who's not really following along as well, but I'm learning. But ultimately, to see the passion in these oftentimes young, I'm like I'm the silver-haired fox of the group. Trust me, my first day full time there was we welcomed three young engineers, and they were roughly the age of my oldest daughter, who's 22, and they two of them had come from Stanford and were taking a sabbatical due to COVID. These brilliant minds, but the difference, they're passionate, and they want to see change. They want to help decarcerate. They want to end mass incarceration.
That brings me up my point. When you say passion, so that's what I want. My final question, that same passion that you have, that has been throughout your career, the passion that you're seeing with them, tell me the philosophy and the passion, and what is it that you see as the wrong that you're trying to right?
I can recall, and many of us have the same story, and it's certainly not a novel concept, but it always stuck with me. Both my mother and father instilled in me, and they were politically diverse. They were of different parties, their registration, and ultimately we're able to iron through those political differences pretty well. But they always told me there are two kinds of people. Again, don't want to overgeneralize, but those who see an injustice and can walk away, and those who do something to right that wrong, as you said. And I think there's also what I was taught by family is the ability to empathize. And I haven't had any. I've seen some mental illness in an aunt who's actually died a couple of years ago, but I was essentially her guardian, and I watched her struggle. A really talented lady who struggled with mental illness, and I've not had anyone close to me. I've had friends, but it's not a family issue in terms of someone who might be addicted. So I haven't seen, but it's the ability to see it all around me and see it all around us as a community and as a state and as a country. and then see it in the system. When I spent several years prosecuting, I was a city attorney, worked with law enforcement. I spent nearly 30 years in the criminal justice system, and I've just seen the system just chew people up and spit them out. Not ever getting to the root cause, ever. I mean, not, again, helping them in any way, making the problem worse. Same with juvenile. We haven't gotten around to juvenile justice, but that's a reality of the juvenile justice system, and thankfully we've had some real success here in Kentucky at reforming that system. But I think it comes from that empathy and that knowing that we can do better, and and the political momentum that I felt, and we felt as a state in 2009 and 10 and 11, where we could come together. At that time, you remember there was a Democrat-controlled House in Kentucky and a Republican-controlled Senate, and the bill passed, again, there were two votes, but essentially it was, 98-1 or 96-1 in the House if a couple people abstained or weren't there that day, and 38-0 in the Republican Senate. And folks, we had standing ovations in both chambers that day, and I've never sensed that kind of feeling in politics. And we were able to move forward on drug policy, but it became more contentious. And that window hasn't closed, and there's still opportunity. And I hope the legislature can come together, and I hope that an article like mine and the others in the magazine and so many others who've been fighting in Louisville and throughout the state can come together and push our legislature and push our Congress to more reform as well. Because the window's still open, and we can come together, and these principles are not owned by one party. And a better criminal justice system is something we all want.